Our subject in this webinar is an important one in learning to set boundaries. It is all about managing guilt. How many of us feel guilty on any given day for something we did do, didn't do, something we said, something we wanted to do, something that we forgot? In caregiving, guilt is a significant aspect. We are going to learn how to manage guilt so that we can be proactive and avoid feelings of thinking, I should have done that. I shouldn't have said that. I should have done something better. Let's get started. You know the rules by now, the housekeeping rules. I use the term elderly parent or elderly parents for the person for whom you are providing care. Outline for this module is in the course materials for the program. Print the slide handouts for each section. The ellipses are purposeful. They help you follow along with the slides. At the end of managing guilt, you should be able to recite reasons that guilt exists in caregiving experiences. Identify the relationship between managing guilt, opportunity, and choice. Implement pragmatic steps to manage care situations that focus on reasonable actions. And I stress the word reasonable, and you'll see why as we go along. Feelings of guilt are connected to the choices we make that affect ourselves, negatively affects another person. We have to find a way to resolve the way that we're feeling. Guilt is a feeling that results when we believe we've harmed somebody or harmed ourselves. Guilt thrives in caregiving situations. Caregivers feel guilty for not being able to do more. Elderly parents make adult children feel guilty for not doing more. Guilt-ridden statements include, I should have known, I should have done that, I feel bad about that. The other reason that guilt exists in caregiving is because the choices we make extend beyond the effect on ourselves. Our choices affect other people. They affect elderly parents. Based on our life experience, we may think or make choices about a situation very differently from the way that an elderly parent or another person would choose. In thinking about ways to manage guilt, we can think about how we would treat someone else in a similar situation or how someone else might want to be treated. So we look at it from our perspective and then an opposite perspective. That dual perspective may provide a better guide for us to make guilt-free decisions. When caregivers feel guilty, sometimes they continue to do more and more and more and more to make up for feeling guilty. Doing more and working harder, though, can result in compassion fatigue and burnout. Research confirms that caregivers have poorer physical and mental health than the person for whom they care. We all know this. Sometimes we don't realize it until it happens. Caregivers fail to take time to care for themselves. That failure for self-care, it can result from a sense that caring for my elderly parent is more important than time to care for myself, or I feel guilty that I didn't do this, so I have to overcompensate for guilty feelings. Guilty feelings easily create a path to a low sense of self-worth or a low sense of self-esteem. But there is a bright spot in this. Guilt leads to opportunity for change. Guilt provides many opportunities for change. Change can be managed by taking responsibility for how we respond to the change. We all have the power to control what we think, feel, and do, although at times that may be difficult to do. Ask ourselves these questions. We have to ask ourselves questions. What would I do if I didn't feel guilty about this? What are the possibilities and the opportunities in this situation? How else can I look at it? If I'm looking at it from this way, what is the exact opposite way to look at it? What can I do to make the situation better? Being compassionate with ourselves and others helps us take responsibility for our role for what we did in the situation. We're also more likely to be open to feedback from others when we realize that we don't know everything. People who are closed-minded tend to think that they know everything about situations. In caregiving, because we know we don't know everything, being open-minded is extremely important. Instead of dwelling on guilt, think of what changes can improve the situation. Apologize if you've done something wrong. Keep moving forward. Take it one step at a time, one day at a time. Remaining stuck in a guilty rut won't improve the situation, and it certainly won't make you feel better. The idea of guilt, looking at opportunities presented by change and making choices are connected. So we have guilt, we have change that's happening, and we have the ability to make choices to make things better. To make different choices, we want to understand if we have habits that are causing issues that we may not notice or understand. An example of this, how many of you remember your dating years? How many times did you yourself, or you heard a friend say, gosh, I picked the wrong person again. It didn't work out. And yet you keep picking the same wrong person. This ingrained habit of choosing the wrong thing and not realizing that we're doing it, it can be related to Albert Einstein. He had a saying. Albert Einstein, in all of his research, said that we can't solve problems at the level of thinking we were at when we created the problem. What does that mean? It means that the way that we think when we create a problem isn't going to get us out of the problem. It's not going to get us out of causing the problem again. We have to look at situations differently. We have to be open-minded. We have to be willing to learn. We have to be willing to change. The opportunity to learn from situations and relationships, it's present in all aspects of our life, not only caregiving. Everything that you are learning in these modules, in these sections, in these parts, you can apply it to the rest of your life. This is beneficial. This is a deep dive look into family relationships and work relationships and caregiving. If we feel guilty because something isn't working out in our lives, it's up to us to investigate how to make the situation better. If our actions create a repeated situation that doesn't work out, we have to choose to look at things and to act differently. Nobody's perfect. We all make mistakes. Learning to be more self-compassionate about feeling guilty and examining what worked and what didn't work creates progress through all of this change. And I'll share a personal situation. Over 20 years ago, 30 years ago, when I was helping care for my elderly parents with my brothers and sisters, we made so many mistakes because we didn't know what we were doing. We didn't know what questions to ask. We didn't know what could happen. We didn't interact appropriately with the healthcare system, even though I had a sister who was a nurse. I had a sister who worked at the hospital where my mother ended up all the time. We didn't know, which is part of what thrust me into becoming a caregiving expert, my thirst for education about caregiving, working with families, becoming a professional fiduciary, a care manager. If I would have had the knowledge that I have today, back when my parents needed care, that situation would have been so different. And initially, I had a lot of guilt about that. I felt like we were stupid and we didn't know what we were doing and we didn't ask the right questions, and that caused my parents to die. I had a lot of guilt around that. Today, my goal is to help caregivers avoid guilt, to avoid not knowing about situations, which is why I go into a lot of this information in the depth that I do, which is why you will see that from module to module, there's parts of information that I repeat, and it's because of the rule of 7 that you may or may not remember when we first started these programs. The rule of 7 is that for us to pay attention, for information to be relevant, we have to hear it from 7 to 20 times before it makes sense. And if we're in a situation where the situation isn't relevant, we may hear the information and it may not make any sense to us. So as I've talked, you may come back and watch these modules over again. You may look through your notes again that you've taken. You may come back. That's how we learn in caregiving. That's how we progress. It's one step at a time. It's one day at a time, and we can all do it together. Which takes us to asking the question, what's working and not working? When I had my care management agency, I held weekly meetings with my care staff about this subject. What was working and was not working? When we came to a situation that didn't work out like we had expected or planned, we didn't place any guilt or any shame on the situation. Instead, we evaluated the event and what happened step by step. We focused on the idea as we reviewed that of what could be done differently. We asked a lot of questions. What did we learn from what happened? What questions should we have asked? That is a very important thing to ask yourself. How can we prevent this situation from happening in the future? How can we change the way that we approach interacting with others to deliver positive results? Because many times it's a miscommunication, it's an assumption, it's an expectation, it's something that we think somebody else is going to do where things fall apart. Rather than blaming or feeling guilty, we have to realize that being a caregiver is a learning process. All of life is a learning process. Take action. If something doesn't work, identify that gap or that glitch. Take steps to close the gap. Figure out what you need to do. This takes us to the idea of making choices and taking actions. Steps to manage emotional caregiving situations benefits from a path of evaluation. Number one, ask what an elderly parent wants and expects for care. Then, number two, evaluate what you want as a caregiver, what you can do, and how you can provide care. Then you look at the gaps and the glitches, which can be money, time. It can be person time that sometimes you'll hear me call staffing. Can be realistic thinking, reasonable thinking, and flexibility. Unrealistic expectations, overscheduling, a lack of compromise, they can make problem solving a challenge. Look at situations from a circular aspect, from all aspects. Who can help? What is needed? Is it more of your time or someone else's time to provide care? Is it money? Think of what you and your family can do from a money, time, and person perspective. Be reasonable, though. Be reasonable about the balance between being a caregiver and family situations and taking care of yourself. Because when we're unreasonable, when we create unreasonable expectations, that's when things fall apart. Ask yourself, is there time pressure because of the needs of elderly parents? We've talked about this. Many family members feel that caregiving is a responsibility, that it's the right thing to do. But unbalanced situations where caregivers are doing everything, where elderly parents refuse to participate, where they refuse to be realistic or flexible, results in deadlocks. We have to try to find a middle ground for everybody that offers the best solutions. I can tell you there will be times when doing what an elderly parent wants is not possible. When making difficult decisions, we have to be honest about facts and feelings in the short and in the long term. And here is another story. So this is a story of a caregiver named India, who was a millennial. She was caring for an elderly uncle who had brothers and sisters who lived far away, but they couldn't help. So India was helping her uncle who lived a couple hours away. She was trying to go to school and she was working. And she was stuck in a situation where she felt like she couldn't do it all, and she felt like she had to stop going to school because she had to be that person to care for her elderly uncle. Now, what India didn't realize in this situation was that refusals of care by her elderly uncle put her in this situation. She was putting it all on herself. I can't do this. I've got so much to do. I'm feeling stressed. I have to do this for uncle. It's my responsibility. As we talked through India's situation, what we came to realize was that uncle had money to pay for caregivers. Uncle refused to pay for caregivers. He had unrealistic beliefs about the fact that he didn't need care, that he didn't need help, that he wasn't a fall risk. And yet he was having conversations with India saying, I'll feel really bad if you give up going to school. I'll feel really bad if you quit. What was the question that no one was asking? India wasn't asking the question of how her uncle could help her continue to be a caregiver and continue to go to school. India's uncle wasn't asking the question, India, how could I make this situation easier on you? What can I do to help you continue to help me? They eventually had to come to middle ground and compromise. Uncle had to agree to have paid caregivers certain days of the week, certain hours of the day, so that India could go to school and get her work done. It wasn't that India didn't want to care for uncle. It wasn't that India didn't feel responsible for caring for uncle. It was that India's uncle didn't realize how his inflexibility was affecting India's life. The story had a happy ending. Uncle paid for care. India continued to go to school, and the situation worked out. But sometimes we can come to these family deadlocks because we don't consider the other options besides us providing care, besides us being the own caregiver. We refuse to ask family members for help. We refuse to pay for caregivers when there is money. We refuse to look at opportunities to make situations better. It doesn't have to be that difficult. We have to be open-minded. We have to be flexible. We have to find ways to come to a middle ground. Caregiver health is a huge subject. There are times when being reasonable or honest means that we will disappoint other people. For example, a caregiver whose constant attention to an elderly parent resulted in the caregiver becoming so seriously ill that he was unable to care for an elderly parent. Caregivers have to be attentive to their health. They have to find other options to care for an elderly parent or loved one, like India and her uncle. In extreme situations, having to separate oneself from a caregiving situation, it can bring mixed feelings of guilt and also relief. Thank God. Acknowledge that you as the caregivers have done an excellent job caring for an elderly parent up until now. Now it's time for a different solution. It's time for someone else to provide care because you cannot do it anymore. Don't feel guilty. Feel thankful for what you were able to do. Let's do a summary of managing guilt. Guilt exists everywhere in life. Find ways to reconcile feelings of guilt and be proactive in family caregiving discussions and relationships. Know that you can do the best that you can, and sometimes it's not enough to help elderly parents who need a great deal of care. Know that elderly family members have to be flexible. If they can't be inflexible, you end up in a deadlock, which isn't good for anybody else. We have to find a middle ground in caregiving situations to be able to manage guilt, to be able to look at choices, learn, and move forward together. I'm Pamela D Wilson, caregiving expert, advocate, and speaker. Thank you so much for being with me during this presentation. I will see you in the next webinar.